Have you ever imagined that a simple farmer, someone who seems to live a peaceful life, could be capable of committing the most horrific acts imaginable? What if I told you he turned his farm into a horror movie, feeding his pigs human flesh? Sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? But this isn't fiction. It's a reality so bizarre and macabre that it's still hard to believe to this day. The man responsible is Robert Pickton, and the story you're about to learn is one of the most disturbing in recent history. Picture the scene: a seemingly ordinary farm with pigs, cows, and what appeared to be just a farmhand. But behind this facade lurks something much darker, something many tried to ignore, until the truth came to light in a brutal and unexpected way. How could a seemingly ordinary man hide such evil within himself? And how did he manage for so long to deceive everyone around him? The case of Robert Pickton is not just a murder story, it is a true horror story, where the line between reality and nightmare is blurred once and for all. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you in ways you never imagined. This man, who seemed like just another farmer, was able to transform his property into a veritable hunting ground, where he only to then dispose of their bodies in unimaginable ways. And worst of all, no one noticed for a long time. How did he manage to do this without arousing suspicion? The answer will leave you speechless. Pickton's story begins with an ordinary man growing up in rural Canada, in a small town called Port Coquitlam, where everything seemed normal, or at least that's what everyone thought for years. But what many didn't know was that he had a twisted mind, one that drove him to commit unspeakable acts of cruelty. And worst of all, he didn't act alone. His pigs, his victims, and the farm itself were all part of a plan that would only become apparent much later, when the truth came out. What you'll understand next is that evil can lurk where we least expect it, and that what seemed like a simple, isolated life was actually the stage for something much darker. Have you ever stopped to think how someone could hide such a monstrous secret for so long? How did he do it without anyone noticing anything amiss? Robert Pickton for years managed to deceive the authorities and even his community. He was respected by many, and no one ever suspected that the simple farmer could be responsible for dozens of women's disappearances. And how was this possible? The answer lies in a game of manipulation, cunning, and a lack of empathy that borders on the insane. Little by little, Pickton gained the trust of those around him while secretly transforming his farm into a land of horrors. His crimes began slowly, almost imperceptibly, until they finally became impossible to ignore. What happened in the end, when the truth came out, is even more terrifying than you can imagine. Now, don't think you know everything. What follows will leave you speechless, and with each new discovery, the story will become more complex and disturbing. How did he manage to manipulate his victims? What happened when the police finally intervened? And most frightening of all, how many women actually disappeared at this man's hands? The number of victims, which was initially underestimated, may be much higher than you imagine. Brace yourself, because you're about to enter one of the most bizarre and terrifying stories the world has ever known. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear is just the beginning of an even deeper and more disturbing tragedy. Robert Pickton was born on October 24, 1949, in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, Canada. For many years, he was seen as a simple man, seemingly ordinary. He lived on a secluded farm, surrounded by pigs, with a routine that seemed as routine as any other. However, behind this facade of a friendly, hard-working farmer, Pickton carried a dark secret, one he hid very well, until the truth, more terrifying than anyone could have imagined, emerged from the shadows. Pickton's life had always been marked by simplicity. He and his brother grew up on a farm where, supposedly, they raised pigs and farmed the land. But it soon became clear that Pickton's farm was no ordinary place. There was something strange about the land, something that, for a long time, no one could see. You seemed like a normal person, greeting his neighbors, keeping a low profile in the community. These people had no idea that the man who passed through their lives every day was hiding something as monstrous as any macabre legend the human mind could create. But the hidden truth began to reveal itself as Pickton became the center of a series of police investigations. What initially seemed like a mystery of disappearances turned into one of the greatest tragedies in criminal history. Women vanished without a trace, disappearances that, at first glance, seemed unconnected. However, over time, The clues began to fit together in ways no one could have predicted, and Robert Pickton's farm became the epicenter of a discovery that would shake Canada and the entire world. What he did on his farm, where neighbors and acquaintances saw only a quiet man and nothing more, is so repulsive that it beggars any logical explanation. How could someone so ordinary, so seemingly harmless, be involved in something so monstrous? How did he manage to go unnoticed for so long, when the signs were there all along, waiting to be seen? What happened inside Robert Pickton's mind, and how was he able to transform a simple worksite into a scene of unspeakable horror? The answer to these questions is not easy to digest. Throughout his life, Pickton came to believe his actions were justifiable, as if he had a right to do what he did, as if he were on a personal journey of transformation, but without realizing he was descending ever deeper into an abyss of cruelty and destruction. In his twisted mind, the women he were nothing more than objects, things he could control and manipulate as he pleased. And the most terrifying thing is that he did this with frightening coldness, as if it were a normal part of his daily routine, without any sign of remorse or regret. It's important to understand that Pickton's normalcy was a carefully constructed facade, but deep down he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just an ordinary man, but someone with a twisted mind, a mind that didn't see his victims as human beings, but as disposable pawns in a macabre game. How he managed to reach this point, where his actions became so insane and monstrous, is beyond comprehension, and that's precisely what makes his story so disturbing. He was convinced he was above the law, that he could act without being caught, and for a long time, he was right. For years, while his victims disappeared, Robert Pickton continued to maintain his appearance as an ordinary farmer. He was known for being a quiet man, but in reality he was one of the most ruthless and cruel killers in recent history. Not only did he brutally murder his victims, but he also fed their bodies to the pigs on his farm, a fact that only exacerbated the nature of his crimes. While everyone around him was completely unaware of Pickton's true nature, he continued his journey of horror as if invincible. Gradually, investigations began to reveal that the women's disappearances were far from coincidental. The pattern of violence and death surrounding Robert Pickton became increasingly clear. The search for the hidden truth began to take shape, and the man who had been seen as just a simple farmer was now the prime suspect in a series of unspeakable crimes. But Robert Pickton's story isn't just about a killer. It's about a mind capable of transforming from someone seemingly harmless into a monster, a ruthless killer who believed his authority over life and death was beyond question. Pickton's transformation is a tragic example of how a person's decisions, however subtle they may seem at first, can become a dangerous and irreversible path. As he began to believe his victims were nothing more than disposable objects, his mindset became increasingly distorted until he found himself at a point of no return, where human life completely lost its value. With each new act of violence, he distanced himself further and further from humanity until the horror he created became uncontrollable. And, as you can imagine, the discovery of all this was a shock not only to the authorities but to the entire community. Those who knew Robert Pickton, who saw him as just an ordinary farmer, could never have imagined he was behind something so horrific. The impact of his arrest was so profound that it shook the entire town and even the country. Pickton's story is an example of how evil can often hide beneath a facade of normalcy, and how important it is to be alert to the signs we often ignore. And as revelations began to emerge, the truth about who Robert Pickton really was became clearer. But most disturbing of all was the discovery that the full extent of his crimes was still far from being fully revealed. How many more victims did he claim? How many other women disappeared and were never found? The final number of his victims will never be known for sure, but what we do know is that he left a trail of blood and pain that will never be forgotten. Robert Pickton's farm, in the heart of the sleepy town of Port Coquitlam, hid something far darker than anyone could have imagined. At first glance, it was just a simple rural space with a few pigs and cows, nothing out of the ordinary. Those around him saw only a farmer, someone who lived a secluded life, perhaps a little eccentric, but still within the standards of a quiet country life. However, what was happening behind the farm gates was something that defied any rational explanation, something that, if discovered earlier, would have shaken everyone irreparably. Robert Pickton, while still seen as just another solitary man, actually transformed his farm into a veritable stage of horror. His isolation wasn't just a lifestyle choice, but a strategy to carry out his crimes more easily, without arousing suspicion. What appeared to be just a place where he raised pigs and dedicated himself to farm work hid one of the biggest secrets in criminal history. The killer fed on his victims, or rather, he fed them to his pigs. The women who disappeared from the city, many of them prostitutes, others in vulnerable situations, were unknowingly taken to this isolated refuge where their lives would end. What's even more disturbing, however, is not just the act of murdering them, but what Pickton did afterward. He disposed of his victims' bodies in a truly macabre manner. The human flesh, after being removed, was fed to his pigs, transforming the act of murder into something even more sinister. It wasn't just an ordinary crime. Pickton seemed completely detached from reality and humanity. How could someone go so far as to turn death into a product to be consumed by animals, without any regret or fear of the consequences? The most terrifying thing is that he did it meticulously and coldly, as if it were just another part of his routine. For him, there were no limits. The victims disappeared and, behind the farm gate, the processing began. But the story doesn't end there. Some accounts indicate that Pickton's monstrosity wasn't limited to pigs. Some say he also cooked human flesh and served it at private parties for select guests. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to be at one of these gatherings, believing it was part of a common meal, when in fact, what you were consuming could be the result of someone else's violence and terror. The human mind, when confronted with this kind of atrocity, cannot even comprehend the depths to which Pickton had sunk. Robert Pickton's farm, far from being an ordinary workplace, was a veritable factory of horrors. Every corner of the property held a dark history. Every plot of land bore the weight of a stolen life. While many viewed him as a simple farmer, the man behind this facade was a ruthless predator, and his hunt had a clear objective: to eliminate his victims without a trace, without arousing any suspicion. The disappearances of women in the town, though alarming, were not being connected, and meanwhile, Pickton continued his journey of terror, undisturbed, with the pigs feeding on the victims, and the neighbors and community unaware of what was really happening there. And here lies the most macabre aspect of this story, the method with which he did all this. The transformation of a seemingly simple man into a monster capable of swallowing other people's lives so coldly and calculatingly is not something that happens overnight. Something in his mindset broke. Something in his journey became distorted until he began to see his victims as less than human. It wasn't just about killing. It was about denying the dignity of life, about transforming other people's suffering into something banal. The idea that his victims were merely things for him to use as he pleased, even to feed the pigs, makes the human mind disbelieve in the reality of his actions. However, like every dark story, the truth begins to emerge, and after a certain point, the mysteries surrounding Pickton's farm began to unravel. The impact of this discovery was immense. The revelation that the farmer was responsible for a series of such heinous murders, and that he not only killed his victims but treated them as disposable objects, left an indelible mark on criminal history. The very fact that he seemed to have no remorse or regret for his actions only amplifies the horror of his journey. And so what seemed like just a peculiar man on a secluded farm became the center of a police investigation that would expose the most disturbing layers of the human mind. Robert Pickton was not just an ordinary killer. He was a man who had given himself over to a destructive mindset, one where his victims were worthless. He had become so immersed in his own distortion of reality that his journey knew no bounds. And yet, even as the truth has come to light, the details of his crimes still leave many unanswered questions. The most terrifying thing about all this, however, is the shadow that hangs over the numbers and the undiscovered bodies. How many women were actually victims of Pickton? The exact number will never be known, but the impact of his actions, the revelations about his true nature, and the horrific transformation behind his farmer facade continue to resonate. As more details about the crimes began to emerge, the question became inevitable. How could a man transform into a monster without anyone noticing? How could something so insane happen without the evidence being discovered first? Pickton's farm became the setting for a living nightmare, but the revelations about him are only the beginning of the story. The scars left by his actions, the pain of his victims, and the impact on the social fabric of Port Coquitlam are deeper than anyone could have imagined. For years, Robert Pickton's farm was a place of silence, of a seemingly harmless routine, hiding the horrors unfolding behind its fences. What began as a series of mysterious disappearances eventually became a nightmare that would take police a long time to unearth. The women who disappeared from Vancouver, many of them in vulnerable situations, were increasingly forgotten in the statistics of a large city. But as the disappearances piled up, something began to change. A sense of unease gripped authorities. It was almost as if the echoes of these disappearances refused to be ignored, and an invisible web of clues began to form, a network that would finally bring the hidden truth to the surface. For a long time, Pickton managed to deceive everyone around him. He knew how to behave impeccably, how to disguise his intentions, and how to maintain his facade of an ordinary farmer. Those around him saw him as a recluse, but nothing more. Even with the growing wave of women's disappearances, the connection to the farmer seemed elusive, and the truth still seemed a long way off. Initially, the police didn't even consider the possibility that he could be responsible for something so massive, so horrific. The case seemed trapped in a web of uncertainty, where answers eluded authorities, and the mystery only deepened. However, the investigation gained momentum. Little by little, connections began to emerge, like pieces of a twisted but essentially connected puzzle. It was as if the city of Vancouver was enveloped by a sense of unease, a subtle fear that hung in the air. Details previously ignored began to be re-examined, and it was then that the police finally began to connect the dots no one else had noticed. The discovery of the truth wasn't instantaneous, and the journey to that moment was filled with tension, twists and turns, and moments of pure anguish. How could someone so seemingly ordinary, living a secluded life on a farm, be responsible for such a large number of disappearances? The answer seemed to lie in something bigger than anyone could imagine. The key to solving the case lay, curiously, on Pickton's farm itself. But to get there, the police needed to overcome the discomfort surrounding this investigation. They needed to go beyond first impressions and look more closely at the signs that had previously gone unnoticed. The real turning point came when police began focusing on the pattern of disappearances, trying to identify any connection between the victims. Many were homeless women, and therefore invisible to much of society. But that didn't mean their lives were worthless, and little by little, a darker story began to emerge. Previous investigations had left doubts, but it was a fresh look at the clues and a meticulous study of the evidence that finally established the connection between the disappearances and Pickton's farm. It was at this point that authorities finally decided to conduct a more thorough search of Pickton's property. Fears that the horror they might find was far greater than they had imagined began to materialize. What they discovered at the farm was far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. There were human remains, traces of violence, and a clear attempt to conceal what had happened. The farm, which appeared to be a simple work site, turned out to be a grim cemetery, a place where Pickton's victims met their final fate in macabre fashion. When the truth finally began to unfold, the evidence didn't lie. The nightmare became an inescapable reality for Robert Pickton, and what seemed like a mere mystery of disappearances turned into one of the most shocking and disturbing cases in Canadian criminal history. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and incomplete, now formed a clear picture of the depravity and terror Pickton had caused. He was no longer an ordinary farmer, but a monster who had managed to deceive everyone, and his true face was finally exposed, bringing to light the horrors hidden beneath the veil of normality. The hunt to catch Pickton was not simple. He managed to evade suspicion for years while his victims disappeared. But in the end, the truth came out, and how he managed to elude authorities for so long is as disturbing as the crimes he committed. How could he be so cold and calculating? How could he maintain a facade of normalcy while carrying out such atrocities? These questions remain to this day, a reflection of the monstrosity that can exist where we least expect it. The moment of the final revelation was a shock to everyone. The victims, who had previously been mere numbers amid a series of disappearances, were now real people, with stories, dreams, and lives cruelly stolen. The discovery of what Pickton did to them brought forth indescribable pain, and the impact of this revelation reverberated throughout the community and beyond. But as the investigation continued, other questions arose. How many more were victims? What was the true extent of his depravity? And most disturbing of all, How many victims might he have left behind, whose remains might never be found? Robert Pickton's journey of discovery was undoubtedly one of the most terrifying, not only for what he did, but for how he managed to evade so many investigations for so long. His twisted and dark mind managed to hide the truth for years, until the clues finally connected, leading authorities to the place where the terror unfolded. Pickton's farm, once seen as a simple plot of land, became the center of one of the most sinister investigations in recent history, revealing the true face of the man who for so long was able to deceive everyone around him. Robert Pickton is undoubtedly one of the most sinister names in the history of crime. His story isn't just a simple murder case. Rather, it's a tragedy, a horrific transformation, and a manifestation of the evil that can lurk where we least expect it. When we look at him, he seems ordinary, even harmless, an isolated farmer, a seemingly normal worker. But the reality was far more terrifying than any fiction we could imagine. What Robert Pickton did, not only because of the brutality of his crimes, but also because of how he managed to deceive society and the authorities for so long, leads us to deeply reflect on the limits of what we can know about the people around us. He was convicted of 6 murders, but police believe the number of victims could be much higher, reaching as many as 49 women. This number, if true, reveals the magnitude of the terror he caused, the suffering he inflicted for years, and the emptiness he left behind. But what shocks us even more is understanding how he managed to hide this nightmare for so long. He knew exactly what to do to keep his facade intact. He manipulated, disguised, and exploited his victims' invisibility to continue his crimes. And what is most disturbing, he didn't act like a monster in plain sight, but rather as someone completely integrated, living among us, sharing the same reality, without anyone being able to see what lay behind that mask of normality. And this leads us to ask, how does someone reach this point? What makes a seemingly ordinary person transform into such a cold and calculating serial killer? What is the mindset that allows a human being to see their victims not as people, but as disposable objects? The answer lies not in a single moment or decision, but rather in a set of choices and transformations that, over time, shape who a person becomes. Robert Pickton didn't wake up one day and decide to kill. No, he shaped himself, making decisions, nurturing increasingly dark and twisted thoughts. His journey, far from unique, serves as a warning to us all. Evil can lurk anywhere, and people can transform into something unrecognizable without us even realizing it. The impact of this story goes beyond the numbers and the horrors committed. Pickton's true legacy lies in the reflection his story forces us to make on human nature, the choices we make, and the masks people can wear. He reminds us that reality, however frightening it may seem, can be far more disturbing than any fiction. Often we are so caught up in our daily lives that we fail to see what's happening around us, what other people are doing in the shadows, out of sight. Robert Pickton's case makes us reflect on the vulnerability of so many. Many of his victims were women in vulnerable situations, with little visibility in society. Women who were often ignored and despised, and who ended up becoming easy prey for him. This raises an important question. How many other stories of pain and suffering go unnoticed every day? How many other Picktons are living among us, hiding behind the facade of an ordinary and harmless life, ready to act unnoticed? The legacy of this story also teaches us about the fallibility of our perceptions. How can a person be so effective at hiding their true feelings, their deepest intentions, for so long? How is it possible that such a ruthless killer went unnoticed for years? The truth, painful as it may be, is that we are often unprepared to see the true face of evil. It doesn't come with a warning sign or a label warning of its dangers. Evil hides subtly, disguised in ordinary faces, in banal behaviors. And this is one of the harshest lessons we can learn from the Robert Pickton case, that reality is often not as we imagine, and the truth is much closer than we'd like to believe. And the impact doesn't stop there. Over the years, Pickton's case has sparked discussions about how victims, especially marginalized women, are treated by society. The way the investigation was initially conducted reflects a lack of priority given to these lives that, for many, were considered less important. This brought to light a profound reflection on social justice and the need to give voice to those who are often silenced. Pickton's victims were not only ignored by the authorities but also by society at large. Their stories, their pain, were minimized in favor of other narratives. And this is something that needs to change. Robert Pickton leaves us with a sense of unease, a feeling that, Even though the truth has been revealed, there is still much we don't know. And the question that remains is, how many other secrets are hidden in places we believe are safe? How many other stories, however bizarre they may seem, are waiting to be discovered? Ultimately, Pickton's case is a painful reminder that evil can lurk where we least expect it. And the only way to confront it is by realizing that what we see on the outside doesn't always reflect what's happening on the inside. This story, which began as a simple case of disappearances, revealed a much deeper and more disturbing truth, a truth that challenges our understanding of humanity and reminds us that, in some cases, reality can be infinitely more frightening than any fiction we can create. If you've made it this far, you know how profound and twisted this story is. I hope these reflections on Robert Pickton's case have made you think about what's really going on around us and how things are often not what they seem. If this kind of content interests you and you want to continue following stories that go beyond the obvious, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. This way, you'll stay up to date with everything that's coming, with more stories that will mess with your head. And if you're curious to learn more, there's a video right here that complements everything we discussed today. Click there and join me on this journey. Let's continue exploring this universe of mysteries, secrets, and discoveries together. See you soon.